Any other questions, please?
Can I go?
Yeah, who would join?
Bear with me the way I'm gonna be
Okay.
asking this. And I think what maybe some of, and I'm gonna call it confusion, is that we understand that we're already sitting at a deficit. Where we don't understand is because we kind of don't see it in here, like where is the deficit? And that's just me, my mind, and work way of trying to look at these figures. I could see that we're trying to project what our resources are, and I think that projection, and you said this a lot of times yesterday, is not your own, but it's stuff that's coming from the county, okay? And it's the county's suggestion that we, I guess, have the ability to tweak or change or ignore or go along with. And I think from a lot of it, you've agreed that these are the figures that we're gonna use because they came from the county, and that part's okay. I understand too, if we try to do a comparison from last year to this year, and this is where maybe, and I don't know if you could answer this, and maybe the mayor could, with all the layoffs that we did and all the cuts that we did last year, and I think what we're trying to kind of understand is how much of that, what is the amount of all the cuts? Because that plays an important part of, if you're looking, and I'm just asking this because I think there's a lot of us that are doing the, well, from 13 to 14, this is what we see, and there's this like gap in the middle, and are we like really cutting all of that, and where did that gap come from? The gap, the missing gap of the numbers comes from a lot of the layoffs that we did and cuts, but do you have a rough idea of what that is? And is part of the deficit that we're sitting at right now part of that deficit? And Bill, I'm asking this question because this is where I see you kind of asking some of this stuff, and based on, I mean, you know, you did a lot of work doing this, and I appreciate that, regardless of what I said yesterday, okay? I'm not saying that it's right, but I appreciate what you're doing, and by looking at this, I understand where you're coming from, and I get your question. I think basically, maybe you're not asking it the right way, and I don't know if I am, but this is what I just see. And I'm just trying to establish some peace, some harmony, and some understanding by ranting or raving over here. So let's just pretend that last year's budget was maybe around 25 million. And that's just what it was, and that was last year. A lot of things happened between last year and this year where we're sitting right now. So where we're sitting right now is there's a projected budget for this year of 18,000. There's about a 18 million. Yeah, 18,000, God, we'd all be in trouble. So there's about a $7 million, what I'll call a gap there. And it's not from $7 million worth of cuts, but it is to the point of, I think part of that minus figure comes from maybe layoffs and some of the things that we did, including some of what we have as our deficit in there. Help me out here, guys.
You're going around and
Am I going around and around? I'm trying to get to the point.
What's your point?
I think the bottom line is seeing those two figures, and you have to be really gentle here because there's people that have been on council for a while that are getting it to a point, and there are some people that have never seen anything like this. They're trying to get to the point, and they see this figure and they see this figure, and then they see what's should be in the middle, and there's no answers for that middle. And I don't know if you have those kind of answers, and I think the mayor could help with some of that. Like, do you have an idea of exactly the total of what we did last year? Roughly, what kind of money did that try to save us? By the layoffs, I mean, you know, do you have an idea of that? Because that is a minus, a negative figure that to me really isn't a deficit, but it was something that we cut out, and that is one of the reasons why this year's resources are so low, because of something that we already got rid of, like, you know, staff and whatever other cuts that we did. Because I think the question is, if we had 25,000 budget last year and now we're going down to 18, how did that happen, and where's that 7 million? Am I saying what you're thinking here? Because I can see kind of what you're kind of saying. So it's a crazy question,
No,
and it's maybe a crazy way of the way it was figured out, and it makes the work kind of sense.
well, part of
Thank you,
it is
Bill.
that you have less revenue.
Right, so listen to this and see if you get it.
You have less revenue. On the revenue statement, the 4-page document, it starts with property taxes.
Right,
Okay, I did go through, because these were numbers more easy to find. There's the 2013 unaudited actuals. That means what actually came in, not what was budgeted,
right.
but what was actual. And then we have the 2014 projected. And
From
you
the
can
county,
Well, for everything.
basically, yeah.
Okay, and to answer your question, if you look on that very last page, page 4, you can see there where the revenue, just because of shortfalls, show a $5 million, that's part of that 7 that you were talking about. And I'll restate that came from 2 purposes. Remember the 2 million that we talked about last night that went away, that we're not budgeting because we do not plan to collect escrow monies. I know that's a sore subject, but the $2 million on page 3,
Right.
that's not budgeted for this year because we've changed the way we will be handling escrow dollars.
Right,
Okay, so that's part of the 5 that's on that bottom, the next page. And then there was other dollars, there was a lot of transfer ins. And transfer ins are paper entries, basically from the general fund to these funds. There's no new dollars. They're not new dollars, okay? So when you take all of those out, then you'll see them as you go through, that was highlighted before, like half, 500,000 in 215, I think it was stated, and 216. So when you add up all those 500,000s and 200,000s,
that makes close to the $2 million.
yeah, that brings you to this 5 million that we're talking about.
Okay.
So some of it was just paper, so that's why the revenue went down substantially. So if you look like on the top of page 2, and you have your 216 fund that was spoke about earlier. This is the revenue, it's a 4-page.
Got it.
Okay, you see where it has 2 items there, it has transfer in, that 579,000. Those are not new dollars, those are paper. When it said, every time you have a transfer in, you have to have a transfer out. It has to balance to 0. So I'm just saying, you have all these transfer ins, it's just coming from another, it's just like moving from this hand to this hand, but nothing new coming in. So when I took all of those out, that's how we ended up with the $5 million change. So it's not totally a loss in revenue because the transfer ins and outs are not new dollars, okay? The other side of that is the transfer from, which should show up in the general fund in the expenses, if we had 2013 expenses. That's the way proper accounting should be. Now, what it actually shows, I can't tell you right this minute. Some of the questions you're asking, I plan to be able to answer when Councilman Trudinsky and I meet for the Finance Committee. I had a call from the auditors, again today, the state auditors. They're still trying to wrap it up to see where we are in terms of fiscal caution watch or emergency, so they're still gathering that. And those are the numbers that's the best numbers that we will have versus the printouts that's being passed around. Because remember, those are our numbers. What you see in those financial statements in the SSI, those are numbers that we put in. So, you know, but in terms of going through, they're actually going through the checkbooks and all of this, then they're actually seeing for themselves. They're using source documents. The source document, the actual bank statement, would tell how much they went to the bank. It's not a number that we gave them. It's a number that they can look themselves. They're actually looking at not council checks, but checks written. In this way, this is actually the checks that went through the bank. So this is how they're compiling their documents, and that's probably what's taking them a little longer. And just keep in mind that this year, we're really going through maybe like 5 quarters instead of 4, because there's a lot of expenses in the 2014 that may have been paid that belongs to 2013. All of that has to be sorted out to truly say what was the activity in 2013 and how much of it belongs to 2014. It's not something that can just be readily pulled out and look at some numbers to say, oh, in 2013, we spent 25 million. That number is not apparent at this point, which we hope will be soon for 2 pieces if we have an annual audit, or even when they do the gap audit, which is going to be every year. We'll have some numbers that's audited that we can rest our head on, but otherwise, just pulling out numbers, I can't address them. All I know is what I actually see. So.
Okay, Mr. Jackson, you had a comment? Question?
Well, question, yeah. For the non-union people, when they retire or for whatever reason leave, is there there's a, I'm going to call it separation pay? Is there something that they get for years worked that they get when they leave?
Through the chair, excuse me, I'd like to answer Mr. Jackson's question, Councilman Jackson. You got another conversation going on?
Yes.
I say no, and she says yes.
I'm sorry.
She's talking to herself.
Through the chair to Councilman Jackson, when non-union employees retire, they usually accumulate sick time. There's a certain percentage. If they don't use it, they get paid. They usually always use their vacation time. There's really not much of a, like a final payout or buyout for non-union. There's more money involved when it's a union with longevity, and they have comp time. Comp time's another issue. Non-union does have comp time. They have to be paid out for that. So we're usually not talking about large sums of money versus union employees. There's a pretty big difference.
Is that possibly, could that be one of the things in the other category that we're looking at in here?
Which are you referring to, Mr. Johnson?
This is something I thought about. I didn't write it down which one, but in the,
Is that what you're looking at?
yes.
Okay. In the others, there's other pay that's listed, and mostly you'll see that's with the bargaining group, and that would include like longevity, any pay that they receive for education or paramedic, all the contracted kinds of compensation. Is not actual wages, and as like I say, mostly is for the bargaining. So it will be longevity, like I say, education, paramedic, SWAT, all those kinds of pay.
Physical proficiency.
Yeah, those.
Passing the physical fitness test.
I guess the point I'm trying to get to, in our budget, is there a certain amount of money set aside per hour for that fund, so when somebody does retire, that the money is there? Or per day, or something, that is the time or the money that's given out is based on hourly or salary or years or whatever. So some type of time frame in there that a dollar amount is attached to. And I'm just asking, in the budget, is that being put away in a fund so that when those people retire, that the money is in a line item already and not then has to be transferred from somewhere else?
No, that's an actual expense at the time of occurrence. For example, we can't predict, for example, who may retire next year and then say it's going to equal this or equal that. Now, internally, the department heads may know that they've been told that they expect people to retire. And so, but in terms of the budget, no, we cannot budget that. I mean, because we don't have a handle on it. I mean, I have no way of knowing as we budget who may retire for what that may amount to until we actually get a letter saying, I am retiring as of this date. And also, as the mayor has stated, the other pay, the other items are basically set by contract with the unions. The other is set by the handbook, which says if you retire or leave at this given point, you would have so many sick days paid or so many vacation. But again, there's no way of predicting that, because even though I may have 10 vacation days today, and I say I'm not going to use them, but I retire a month from now, and somehow I've used them all, I mean, there's no way of determining it. So that's a cash transaction at that time, and it shows up in wages in terms of vacation and sick time. It shows up in your pay as salary and wages. But there's no pot of money saying that for everyone that may retire, we're going to pull that money, you know, because you have no idea. You terminate, you know, retire. So we don't, that's accrual accounting, which I was trying to explain last night. We're on a cash basis, so we record what we write checks for, and we record what money comes in that we deposit in the bank. When they do the GAAP accounting, you may see that on the balance sheet, that kind of information. And then maybe one day it'll be good if we can have a session to go through that. I mean, I don't mind doing it to help you understand, or the auditors can go through and have a meeting with them to help you understand the financial statements that's in the audit for these gaps you're talking about. A lot of them are dealing with the balance sheet or accrual or liability assets and what have you that will not be shown in these statements. These are cash items. So I mean, we can plan to do that at some future date so that it will help everyone to understand the financial statements and then those questions you're asking like this, because they do record that in the audit. They call it uncompensated absences, and that's a balance sheet item. And you may see how much they predict that if we left, or at the end of the year, not going forward, but that's the past year, but that's the only thing that's certain is what has happened already. So they would say at the end of 2013, this is what was on the books for everyone, that if they had left on that date, this is what would be paid out.
Yeah, I would like to be that included in one of the financial sessions, only because if it's not in a line item anywhere, then if that person leaves, I'm assuming then it would come out of the general budget.
It will come from wherever their salary, it follows salaries or whatever program or department that you're in, but more likely it could, or if you're in a special grant program, then it could come out of there. But for the most part, it'll probably be the general fund.
Okay.
At the time that it occurs.
At the time that it occurs.
Right, which no one really knows who around this table, you know, except that person may be planning to leave, you know. So.
Thank you.
Madam President.
Yes, Mayor.
Councilman Jackson, and I appreciate you bringing up that question, because we actually talked about this last year. We have some city employees who are very, in my opinion, very, very good, diligent city employees that even in the point where they're ready to retire or they're going to leave, they notify us in writing months ahead of time that I'm going to exercise my right to retire, and on this date I thank the city for all the years, you know, that they've allowed me to work here, blah, blah, blah. Then we have some very good employees, diligent employees, who never send us anything, and then all of a sudden one day walk in and say basically, I'm done. I'm not, this is my last day of work, and then they don't show up anymore, and then they burn all their, you know, whatever time they have, and they still haven't given us anything in writing. So, you know, you have on one hand some really good communicators, and then on the other hand you have some bad attitudes. So that leaves us where? You know, not knowing if this person is and or leaving or not, or if they're going to stay. And currently we're, you know, we have someone in a department that did exactly that. You know, said, I'm done, last day, you won't see me anymore, but you never know, because I got some unused time, but I think I'm going to burn it all up and not come back. But, you know, I might. Still don't have anything in writing, so we're left holding the bag. So we can't really plan for it.
Okay, are there any other lingering questions? Tony, did you have another?
I have a question that maybe you could explain, and it's something that you started off with yesterday. And I know you're trying to educate us, and you said that there's like 5 major funds, one of them being the general fund. And let me see if I'm gonna explain this the right way. If we have a deficit in 4 out of the 5 funds, that's not a good thing for the state and for the audit. And I think I heard you say, and I don't know if it's called, if this is maybe what I'm using the wrong term, is a transfer in. If there's 3 funds that have a deficit, and is the proper term transferred in to the general fund, obviously making it a bigger deficit, but balancing out these 3 that have gone into the general fund would make us, I don't want to say look better, but for better terms, look better in the eyes of an audit by having one fund that has a deficit rather than having more than one. And is that one of the reasons for some of the, if I'm using the right term, transfer in?
The transfer ins, as it relates to this, I think we're talking about 2 different things.
Okay.
The transfer ins are usually for subsidy. For example, we have the senior center, and we have grants to say we have to match a
Right.
certain amount. This is usually how you use transfers. I mean, not just to say I want to put money over here just so I can charge expenses. Usually transfers are like a subsidy or to match by a contract or something of that
Okay,
nature.
I understand that.
And then you will have to transfer money from the general fund to that fund for whatever you contracted. And that may also happen with some of your infrastructure, your engineering, roads and what have you. I mean, this could be another example. I'm not saying it is, but it could be where the county may say, we'll give you 90% to fix the roads, and you put up the other 10%. Then the general fund, or if there could be another grant to, make it whole, but more than likely, then the general fund would transfer out, that 10% to that respective fund, which is in a different category. So that's usually how, you usually don't just do transfers just because you want to put expenses in this fund. I mean, without some usually contracted kind of reason. But that's how you use transfers, okay? And getting back to your point, deficits are caused, and that's why you have a gap audit. You can have a deficit on the books at the end of the year that's not a true deficit. Let me give you an example. A lot of times grants are reimbursable. So say, for example, you have to spend the money and then you get it back. So say in December, you had, say, like the DARE or COPS or one of those. You pay out salaries and all of those in December. So at the end of December, then it shows a deficit because the money comes in January. But that's taken into consideration when they do the gap, and that's why you have a gap to set up the receivable for that. So there's lots of reasons you can have a deficit, and that's what the auditors are sorting out, whether they're a true deficit or to be reimbursement is waiting to come in, a lot of reasons. Try not to get so technical. But so just seeing a deficit on the book at the end of the year is not necessarily, it depends on what it is. And it also depends on the amount of the deficit. So you could even have a deficit and still not go into fiscal watch. They have, or emergency, is measured by a certain percentage of your revenue. So there's lots of different ways, and that's why I say, I don't want to get too technical, but it's just not just black and white to say there's a deficit, boom. You have to look at why the deficit is there and how much it is relative to your total operations and all of that.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair.
Is it relevant to the what we're talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, go ahead.
We've seen the expected revenue for this year, and you've provided us with a proposal for appropriations. Yet you alluded to earlier that those appropriations don't include some of the anticipated expenses. What is the total amount of expenses we estimate to incur as a city in 2014?
That's not really what I said. What I said is that as it relates to the budget, the critical part that we're looking at here is the general fund, and everything's included. in terms of all the other funds, which are either designated or restricted, they're self-balancing. So even if there's not anything showing there, we just still don't have the liberty to go and spend it on anything else. So I don't think that that is a concern at this point, and we keep discussing the same thing, that if it is a concern, then we can revise the budget immediately or what have you. I think I've answered this a couple of times.
You bring up an excellent point that we can't just spend money from one fund to another as we choose. So then my question is, if our proposed appropriations from the general fund are 13 million, but our expected revenue is only 11.5, where's this other $1.5 million coming from to pay those appropriations?
I would answer again is that in May, the decision will be made to balance that out, okay? Right now, we're trying to put to a budget to operate the next couple of months technically. Then in May, there will have to be a meeting, a session to balance, to make whatever adjustments need to be made. And I think it's understood we're not getting rid of the deficit with this budget. We're just trying to have operating privileges starting April 1st to take us at least until May or so, until this body and the mayor decides what action will be taken, to answer your question.
So, but what we're passing is not another temporary appropriations. What we're passing right now is our annual appropriations. For the rest of the year, according to state law, city charter, this is to be our annual appropriations, not something to get us through April and May. So I think I see why we're having such a disagreement right now. You're approaching it as though this is another temporary appropriation that'll get us through April and May, and I'm looking and saying that's not what the purpose of this document is. It's to lay out the planned expenditures for the rest of the entirety of the year. And so that must be why we are having a hard time coming to an agreement, because we see this drastically different.
I think I disagree again, and I don't want to keep taking up time for this. This budget is the budget according to the law that you're stating that we're submitting for the year until this body submits another budget, which it can do at any time.
This is actually not the Bible. This is not what we are going to go from now until next December, because we have done these, we've all done these before, and I know you've been listening to this, coming to meetings for a long time now, and it's the same thing. We have to have one in December. We passed one in 2013, December, which carried us to now. Now we're doing this to carry us to May to carry us, so it isn't set in cement. So I think basically we're pretty much done here. If we have any lingering questions for tomorrow, we can bring them forward.
Madam Chair, one last thing to mention.
I think we're done, Mr. Brownlee. I really do. Thank you, though. I appreciate your.
I would appreciate a moment to make one last comment.
I think
it's
we're done.
important.
We're done. Thank you. I think we're just repeating ourselves over and over again.
But there's something new that I have to say.
Oh, okay. Well, let's save it for tomorrow. Let's save something.
I think it would be good to consider before our meeting tomorrow.
Okay. This meeting is completed at 7 o'clock, and I do want to mention that Kathy and I will be getting together tomorrow to get a little packet for those of you who have requested